May 4th, 1945. General George Patton's Third Army was advancing toward Pilsen, 50 miles from Prague. His forces were driving through western Czechoslovakia against collapsing German resistance. The Czech resistance was sending urgent messages. Prague is waiting for you. The Germans are collapsing. Come quickly. Patton's forces had covered 600 miles in 3 months at remarkable speed. They had crossed the Rhine, liberated Bavaria, and driven into Czechoslovakia. Prague sat wide open ahead of them. German resistance was minimal. The Wehrmacht was surrendering in droves. Czech partisans controlled parts of Prague already and were begging for American support. Patton could be in Prague within 24 hours. Then the message came from Supreme Headquarters. Halt all advances east of Pilsen. Do not proceed toward Prague. Await further orders. Patton read the order and exploded. His army was positioned perfectly. The Soviets were still fighting through eastern Czechoslovakia, days away from Prague. Why stop now? He demanded an explanation from Eisenhower. The answer would reveal a political calculation that would cost Czechoslovakia its freedom for 41 years. Prague wasn't just another city. It was the capital of Czechoslovakia, the industrial heart of Central Europe, and a symbol that mattered to both Stalin and the West. The Czech government in exile in London had been waiting 6 years for liberation. President Edvard Beneš expected American forces to free Prague. Czech resistance fighters had been preparing for an uprising to welcome American troops. But Stalin had different plans. Soviet forces were advancing through Slovakia toward Prague from the east. Stalin had told Eisenhower that Czechoslovakia fell within the Soviet sphere of operations. While the final political fate of Prague wasn't explicitly signed away at Yalta, the military spheres of operation had been loosely agreed upon. Eisenhower was determined to stick to the line to avoid accidental combat between U.S. and Soviet troops. Eisenhower faced a choice. American forces could reach Prague first easily, but taking Prague would anger Stalin and potentially fracture the alliance before Germany had even officially surrendered. Third Army's position was perfect. Patton had 12th Corps, 20th Corps, and 5th Corps positioned across western Czechoslovakia. His forces were experienced, well-supplied, and facing minimal opposition. German units in Czechoslovakia were surrendering to Americans rather than Soviets. Wehrmacht officers knew what Soviet captivity meant. They were walking toward American lines by the thousands. Czech civilians were waving American flags. Resistance fighters controlled radio stations and were broadcasting appeals. American forces come quickly. We are ready to rise against the Germans. Patton's intelligence officers reported that Prague could be taken with minimal casualties. The German garrison was token. Most Wehrmacht units were trying to flee west to surrender to Americans instead of Soviets. Operationally, it was the easiest objective Third Army had faced in months. A 2-day advance, light resistance, enthusiastic local support. The Red Army still days away fighting through Slovakia. Patton told Eisenhower he could be in Prague by May 6th. Eisenhower told him to stay where he was. What Patton didn't know was that Eisenhower had been coordinating directly with Stalin through military channels. Churchill didn't know about these communications. Eisenhower was operating with a degree of autonomy that bypassed the political concerns of the State Department, focusing strictly on military lines of demarcation. On April 28th, Eisenhower had informed Stalin that American forces would not advance beyond Pilsen and Carlsbad in Czechoslovakia. Stalin had responded immediately, thanking Eisenhower for his decision and confirming that Soviet forces would liberate Prague. Eisenhower was making strategic political decisions about which territories the Western Allies would occupy and which they would leave to the Soviets, without consulting Washington or London. When Churchill learned about Eisenhower's communications with Stalin, he was furious. Churchill sent urgent messages to President Truman. American forces must take Prague. The Red Army must not be allowed to occupy all of Czechoslovakia. But Eisenhower had already given Stalin his word that American forces would halt at Pilsen. Churchill understood what was happening. Soviet forces were occupying every territory they liberated. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. Wherever the Red Army went, communist governments followed. Churchill could already feel the cold breath of the Iron Curtain, even if the phrase hadn't been coined yet. He wasn't worried about a map. He was worried about a shroud falling over Europe. Churchill sent a message to Truman on April 30th. The liberation of Prague and as much of the territory of western Czechoslovakia as possible by your forces might make the whole difference to the post-war situation. Truman was new to the presidency. He had been in office less than 3 weeks. He deferred to Eisenhower's military judgment. If Eisenhower believed the Prague advance was unnecessary, Truman would support that decision. Churchill tried again on May 4th. American forces should push to the Vltava River through Prague. The Soviets cannot be allowed to take all of Czechoslovakia unopposed. The British chiefs of staff backed Churchill. They argued that Prague's liberation by Western forces would strengthen the Czech government in exile and prevent Soviet domination. Eisenhower refused. He told Churchill that he had given Stalin assurances. American forces would not advance beyond the agreed line. The decision was final. Eisenhower's reasoning was clear to him. Maintaining the Soviet alliance mattered more than occupying Prague. The war against Japan was still being fought. Soviet entry into the Pacific War would save American lives. Eisenhower's priority was a clean end to the European war to facilitate the massive transfer of troops to the Pacific. To Eisenhower, Prague was a prestige objective that wasn't worth a rift with a needed ally. Roosevelt had promised Stalin at Yalta that the Soviets would have predominant influence in Eastern Europe in exchange for Soviet cooperation against Japan. Czechoslovakia wasn't explicitly discussed, but Eisenhower interpreted the Yalta framework as giving the Soviets priority. More personally, Eisenhower believed Stalin could be trusted to honor agreements. He had worked with Soviet officers throughout the war. He thought post-war cooperation was possible if the West showed good faith. Taking Prague against Stalin's wishes would damage that relationship and undermine the United Nations framework. Eisenhower wanted to believe in a world where a handshake with a Soviet general meant something. He chose to trust Stalin's word over Patton's instinct. It was a soldier's honor meeting a dictator's ambition. The Czechs would pay the difference. Eisenhower also believed that occupation lines didn't matter that much. There would be free elections in Czechoslovakia. The Czech people would choose their government. Whether Americans or Soviets liberated Prague wouldn't change the democratic outcome. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. On May 5th, the Prague uprising began. Czech resistance fighters seized control of the radio station. They broadcast appeals in English, calling all American forces. Prague has risen. We need immediate support. Barricades went up across the city. Czech partisans attacked German positions. They captured weapons and ammunition. In the chaos, they received unexpected help from Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army, Soviet defectors who had fought for the Germans, but were now looking for redemption and a way to surrender to the Americans instead of Stalin. The plan was to hold Prague until American forces arrived to accept the German surrender. The fighters believed Americans were coming. They had heard Patton was only hours away. They expected liberation at any moment. But Patton's forces stayed at Pilsen. The halt order remained in effect. Eisenhower would not authorize any advance toward Prague, despite the urgent appeals from Czech fighters. German SS units counterattacked the uprising. They were brutal. Civilians were shot in the streets. Resistance positions were shelled. The Czechs were being massacred while American forces sat within striking distance, listening to their radio broadcasts. American GIs in Pilsen sat by their radios, hearing the sounds of women and children screaming for help in broken English. The hardest part for Patton's men wasn't the fighting. It was the silence they were forced to maintain while the radio in the tent wailed for a rescue that wasn't coming. Patton pleaded with Eisenhower. "Let me go to Prague. The resistance needs support." Eisenhower refused. The decision had been made. Soviet forces reached Prague on May 9th. The uprising had been raging for 4 days. Over 1,700 Czechs had died fighting the SS garrison. Thousands more were wounded. The resistance was exhausted. The German commander, General Rudolf Toussaint, had already signed a surrender with the Czech resistance to avoid Soviet capture. But when Red Army tanks rolled into Prague, they were greeted as liberators anyway. Czech civilians cheered. Flowers were thrown. Stalin's propaganda immediately portrayed the Soviets as the heroes who freed Czechoslovakia from fascism. There was no mention that American forces had been closer and could have arrived days earlier. There was no acknowledgement that the uprising had been crushed while Americans waited at Pilsen. The narrative was set. The Soviet Union liberated Czechoslovakia. The Red Army saved Prague. The Communist Party organized the resistance. The West did nothing. President Beneš returned to Prague on May 16th. He found Soviet troops occupying the city. Soviet officers were already meeting with Czech Communist Party leaders. The political groundwork for Soviet control was being laid. Beneš believed democratic elections would still be possible. He trusted that Czechoslovakia could maintain independence despite Soviet military presence. This hope would last 3 years. From 1945 to 1948, Czechoslovakia maintained the appearance of democracy. There were elections. Multiple parties competed. President Beneš governed from Prague. But Soviet influence grew steadily. The Communist Party controlled the Interior Ministry and the police. Soviet advisors worked with Czech security forces. Political opponents began disappearing. Czech Democrats appealed to the West for support. They reminded Britain and America that Czechoslovakia had been promised independence. They pointed out that Soviet pressure was increasing. The West did nothing. Czechoslovakia had been liberated by the Soviets. It fell within the Soviet sphere of influence. American forces had stopped at Pilsen as agreed. In February 1948, the Communist Party staged a coup. Armed workers' militias occupied government buildings. Opposition party leaders were arrested or fled. President Beneš was forced to accept a communist government. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, who had worked for years to maintain Czech independence, was found dead in his pajamas beneath his bathroom window. The communist authorities claimed he jumped. The rest of the world knew he was pushed. When Jan Masaryk hit the pavement at the Chernin Palace in March 1948, it wasn't just a man falling. It was the final echo of the help that never arrived in 1945. The window he was pushed from looked out over a city that Patton could have saved in an afternoon. Czechoslovakia remained under communist control until 1989. Decades behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet troops were permanently stationed on Czech soil. Political dissidents were imprisoned. Free speech was crushed. In 1968, Czech reformers tried to create socialism with a human face during the Prague Spring. They loosened censorship, allowed criticism of the government, and talked about democratic reforms. The Soviet response was invasion. Warsaw Pact tanks rolled into Prague on August 20th, 1968. The reforms were crushed. The leaders were arrested. Czechoslovakia remained a Soviet satellite. Every time a Soviet tank engine turned over in the streets of Prague during the Cold War, it was an engine that shouldn't have been there. It was the ghost of a decision made in May 1945, a decision that traded a tactical win for a generational tragedy. Patton never forgave Eisenhower for the Prague decision. He believed it was the clearest example of political concerns overriding military opportunity. The 16th Armored Division had liberated Pilsen at 8:15 a.m. on May 6th. Patton's cavalrymen stood on the hills outside the city and watched the horizon glow red with the fires of the Prague uprising. They were within striking distance. A morning's march, a mere 2-hour drive, and yet the order was to halt. They had the gas, they had the guns, they had the will. All they lacked was permission. Geopolitical appeasement mattered more than Czech freedom. Patton saw Prague as proof of his broader argument about Soviet intentions. If Stalin wouldn't allow American forces to liberate one city, what did that say about his plans for Eastern Europe? Eisenhower's assumption that occupation lines didn't matter was proven wrong within 3 years. Stalin had no intention of allowing free elections in territories the Red Army controlled. The Czech people paid the price for that miscalculation. 4 decades under communist dictatorship, 2 generations without freedom, all because American forces stopped within reach in May 1945. The Prague decision revealed the pattern that would define the Cold War. Wherever the Red Army went, communist governments followed. No exceptions, no free elections, no negotiated settlements. Churchill had tried to warn Truman and Eisenhower, take as much territory as possible before the war ends. The Soviets will never give back what they occupy. The warning was ignored. Eisenhower chose to trust Stalin and honor agreements. He kept his word to an ally, but in doing so, he unknowingly left a nation to a dictator's mercy. The cost was measured in decades of oppression for millions of people. The lesson should have been learned in May 1945 at Prague. It took 41 more years and the collapse of the Soviet Union before Czechoslovakia regained its freedom.